was located nearby. Her body had been exposed to the environment for the 24 days that she was missing, including very heavy rain, so they actually weren't even able to identify her other than by her dental records. They also estimated the time of death based on the insects that were on their body, her body, and like what cycle of life they were in. Police never released the cause of death to the public because of the confidentiality agreement. They did also search the area for Sarah Spires, but they did not find her. Police were assuming that the killer lived near where Jane's body was found, and they questioned sex workers in the area to see if any suspicious male had been around or was one of their regular clients. They kind of considered everyone a suspect. They even took DNA from Jane's father. And, the task force started to take stock of the similarities between the girls. They're both young, employed, in the same area, drinking with friends. They had average build, similar hair color, of similar socioeconomic status. Both were like young, conventionally attractive girls, and they had attended the same school. Like I think I said before, they believed that the girls got into his car of their own volition, believing that the victims trusted this person in some way enough to get into his car, because it wasn't like a normal thing for them to just randomly get into a stranger's car. They also brought a profiler in from Victoria, and the profiler believed they were dealing with a white male between the ages of 25 and 35, possibly someone who had been abused as a child. A man who's kind of unremarkable in appearance, not handsome, not ugly. They thought he would be organized, kind of social, smart with an above average IQ, and clever. This is Ciara Glennon, who was 27 and the last victim of Williams. So also, as you can imagine, around Claremont, people were very frightened. They had never seen something like this happen, and made him sign a confidentiality agreement, and they again never disclosed her cause of death. Jane and Ciara were found in completely opposite directions from birth. So one was found south, one was found north, which kind of messed them up. So the task force still didn't have a solid suspect until September 1997, when Lance Williams, who was 40 years old, kind of grabbed the attention of the police. They were using female officers to act as decoys for the investigation to try to see if any men would try to pick them up around Claremont, and they noticed that Lance Williams was circling the area a lot. So they had him followed, and they found that every Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, he would get off work and kind of cruise around Claremont, and then he would drive through the Hungry Jack's drive-through, get a chocolate shake, and then drink it as he drove 20 minutes to Northbridge, and then he would come back to Claremont and drive around in a loop 20 to 30 times. So that was very suspicious to them, and it sounds suspicious to me as well. A little background on him. He was kind of described as a loner. He was very depressed. He had attempted suicide, and he struggled with a drinking problem and had 4 DUIs, or driving under the influence. Around 1995, one of his close friends died, and after this, he quit drinking, quit smoking, and quit gambling. And the police thought that possibly this could have sparked his killing spree. They put a lot of resources into surveilling Williams, and the lead detective on the case was actually criticized for kind of having tunnel vision even when other people brought him leads. So he was obsessed with the fact that Williams was their guy. In February 1998, a decoy female police officer ended up approaching Williams and asked for a ride to a bus stop. He brought her to the bus stop and then said, "Oh, let me wait here with you because it's dangerous." To me, that doesn't sound like something a killer would do. And the officer said that he seemed like a little strange, but nothing out of the ordinary. But they still didn't leave him alone, and in 1998, they took him to the station for questioning, and when they stopped him, he actually was reported to have wet his pants. He was very scared about what it was all about. They ended up searching his home and his car and his parents' house, but they didn't find anything. They held him for 13 hours and then eventually let him go. Part of that foundation, the $600,000, went to bring a polygraph test to Australia. Eventually, not surprisingly, the task force was replaced in 2005. They thought they had another lead, where a man named Anthony Clare was convicted of rape in England, and Anthony had at one point lived in Perth, and he was on the suspect list, but he was cleared because he had an alibi. Finally, in 2008, the investigators released CCTV footage of Jane talking to a man the night that she disappeared. They also revealed that they had two people of interest who did not have alibis or lied about their alibis. One was a local convicted sex offender, and one was a martial arts instructor who knew Ciara and had met Jane before. They asked the public for help with this information for the first time in 12 years, but the public was kind of skeptical because so much information had been kept secret for so long and nothing came of this. But finally, in 2015, the police officers on the force that were investigating the crime made a DNA match between the rape of a young girl from 1995 and the Ciara case because they had gotten DNA from Ciara's body. The victim of the rape in 1995 was a 17-year-old girl who was leaving the Bayview Club alone. She was raped and left in a cemetery without her pants. It was a brutal, terrible rape, and her identity was never given. So the police finally made a DNA match and raided the home of Bradley Robert Edwards, a 48-year-old man. The police arrested him, and then finally the details of the case, which had been hidden for so long, came out. This is a photograph of Bradley Edwards. I think this is when he was a little bit younger, because you'll see in the other photographs that he's gained quite a bit of weight. He's a forensic police officer near where Ciara's body was dumped. This is another photo of Edwards with a puppy, which he doesn't deserve. These are the parents of Ciara Spires during the trial at the Supreme Court of Western Australia. This is the home of Bradley Edwards when he was arrested. This is the van that Edwards owned when he was married to his first wife. These are the parents of Ciara Glennon, also at the trial. This is a photo of Bradley Edwards. As you can see, he's gained quite a bit of weight. Also, the attack of the young woman that we talked about in the beginning from 1988 was connected to Edward's attacks, and she and other women who had never been connected appeared in court to testify against him. One of the women, who was a social worker, and she was 70 at the time of the trial, but in her 40s when she was attacked, the cemetery. And that was a year before Ciara Spires was taken. Ciara Spires' body was never found. Also, just so you know, I don't think I said that yet. This girl was forced into his van. She had her hands bound, and she was raped. She ended up being able to go find a payphone, and she called her dad, which I just cannot imagine either being her or being her father. It's just like a horrible, horrible situation. At the trial, it was kind of